We're Brianna and Keely, and you're listening to the Where We Live podcast, where we discuss all things home.
You'll hear from us on residential real estate, the process of buying and selling a home, design trends, entrepreneurship, faith, and much more. In this episode, we talk about foundation issues. Most people have been taught by HGTV that this is an automatic deal breaker, and it's just not true. Here in North Texas, foundation issues are common, and today's episode will help you navigate this issue as both a home buyer and a homeowner.
While Brianna and I aren't foundation contractors, we deal with foundations as part of the real estate transaction almost daily. Today's episode will cover the conditions in North Texas, the types of foundations and red flags to look for, and how to make sure you're properly caring for your foundation for years to come. Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I think this is such a hot button topic. I'm excited to talk about this today because most people are terrified when we talk to them about foundations.
Yep. And it is a very important issue, but we're going to break down for you why it's not a deal breaker issue.
Yes, absolutely. This is going to be dependent on where you live in the country. So what we're going to talk about today is specific to North Texas. And even then there's some nuance with that. But we're going to make some generalizations that will help educate you so that you're not as scared about foundation issues. So here in North Texas, we have clay soil. So it's going to matter a ton what your house is built on. Here in North Texas, it's clay, which means that it's a highly porous soil, which affects a lot of things related to foundations.
Yep. We also in North Texas have periods of very, very heavy rain. You know that if you live here. And then we also have periods of droughts with zero rain and very dry ground. Keely talked about the clay soils, and moisture will affect the way that the clay reacts, and therefore moves or does not move your home, the foundation that your home is on. So when the clay gets wet, it expands. And when it's dry, it contracts. So what this means is that it can actually raise your home if there's too much moisture. And if there's not enough moisture and the soil is contracting, your house can actually sink a little bit. I've seen out showing properties like in the country a little bit in these big backyards during periods of drought, huge cracks in the backyard. I'm not talking about the house. I'm talking about in the soil in the backyard. It's like you better watch where you're stepping so you don't roll your ankle because there's just like a divide.
Yes.
In the yard itself. And that is just a testament showing like, hey, we have droughts, periods with like no rain, and our soil, that's how it reacts when there's a drought.
Yeah, so much of this is going to have to do with controlling the flow of moisture and trying to keep things evenly watered around the foundation of your house. So we're specifically looking at the soil that's like under or right around your home. And so, for example, a house on a slope, if you have the next door neighbor is significantly higher than you, we all know how water rolls down, how gravity works. Their water is headed directly towards your house. So that may be more prone to issues. You may have some water pooling on that side. And on the opposite side of the house, where you're the house that's high and the house below you is on the slope, that may be super dry. And we want to make sure that those things are as even as possible so that you're not getting major tilting, right? That's how that can work. One side's really wet, one side's really dry. We end up with a floor slope that you really, really don't want. And so, we're going to talk a lot. Just prepare yourself about gutters. That's an easy way to make sure that the water runoff from your house is not sitting directly by that foundation, but instead being directed where we want it to go. So that's one of the easiest ways that you can control that water. But we're going to give you a lot more tips and tricks about what to look for, how to remedy it, and what to be concerned about.
Moral of the story is exactly that. It can be remedied. There are ways to mitigate this issue, and each house is going to be a little bit different in that. And so we want you potential buyers and homeowners alike to be educated so that you can have the best outcome.
I always say that it's never a matter of a house being a deal breaker.
Yeah.
It's really just a matter of what is the issue, how much is it going to cost to fix it, and who's going to pay for it. The who's going to pay for it tends to be the deal breaker in buying a home. And so we're here to help you navigate that.
Yep. So let's start out by explaining the different types of foundations that we see here in North Texas. They can be put into two large categories. So Keely and I happen to each have different foundations in our homes. So why don't you start off by talking about the kind of foundation your home is on?
That's great. So my home is on a Pier and Beam foundation, which is as literal as it sounds. There are piers that were drilled into the earth, and then wooden beams were slatted on top of them, and the house was built on top of that. This is much more common, this type of construction, in older homes. My home was built in the 40s, and so that's what was done then most commonly. Therefore, it has a crawl space under the house. So there's a separation between where the earth was, where they'd kind of dug out to be able to put the piers in, and the house itself. So it can vary in how tall it is. My inspector has said sometimes in houses he can stand, and sometimes he can barely crawl through. So varies widely there. But an easy tell on pier and beam houses is there are rectangular vents around the outside at the base of the foundation. And those are literally venting moisture and air to make sure that we kind of can regulate the temperature and the moisture. We don't want molds or it to get really hot or really cold down there. One advantage to Pier and Beam is it's easier access to plumbing. All of the plumbing is just in the crawl space underneath the house. But there is potential for pests, rodents, ants, things like that. If you get a hole in one of your vents or if they dig under your house, there is space down there. So there's kind of pros and cons to both.
Mm-hmm. And okay, well, my house is probably less than a mile away from Keely's house. It's like the opposite. So mine was built in 2016. Pier and Beam is much more common. I don't remember if we said this or not yet, but it's much more common in older homes. My home is not an older home, and my home has what's called a slab foundation. It's like it sounds. The foundation is a concrete slab. I don't have the piers and the beams. I have a slab. So there's nothing drilled way down into the earth like on Keely's, but that also means I don't have a crawl space. There's no open air space at all. It's all filled by concrete. So she talked about having access to the plumbing. Mine doesn't have that. My plumbing is in the slab. That being said, to repeat, we are not foundation contractors, right? We're realtors. But to give you a little bit of an idea of what that means, if you think of like a tennis racket, right? There's the strings.
The grid.
The grid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the grid. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Mm-hmm. Inside of the slab foundation, there is a grid, just like a tennis racket, of rebar. That's what kind of like holds everything together. Because if you had a great big slab concrete and you put something on top of it, it's surely going to easily break. That grid of rebar holds things together, lets it kind of move as needed, okay? There is way more that goes into it than that, but that's to help us understand like super elementary level of what this looks like. So I don't have the same issues of like moisture and like air going through or benefits. Moisture, I call that an issue, but it also could be a benefit that she can control a little bit by she could put a fan down there and move moisture away. I can't do that. But it's not a point of entry for pests. No pests can crawl because there's literally no crawl space. There's no open air space for them to get into. So that being said,
yeah, you won't get to choose.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Unless you're building your dream home, then you get to choose. And we can chat about it then. But for now, most new builds are relying on slab foundations and that a type of technology that relates to that. Neither is better. You just need to be aware of both. And depending on which one you have, we're gonna help you navigate that and take good precautions as a homeowner to make sure you take good care of it.
Yeah.
So when we're walking through homes and going to showings, Brianna and I also aren't inspectors, but we've attended a lot of inspections. And so at showings, we're always on the lookout for things that might be red flags that we need to get a professional to look into further. So some signs to be aware of, and these can be signs when you're living in your home as well, not just when you're evaluating a home to purchase, things that say you might have an issue. Large cracks in the side of your home. Most homes are brick here, so we see a lot of stair step cracking kind of in the mortar of the brick outside. We see larger cracks off the door frame or the window frame. Those are kind of diagonal cracks, typically from the top left or right corners. There may be separating corners at the front of the house, so where there's kind of been a lot of movement in those frieze boards in the front. I would say one of the biggest ones is a straight slopey or bumpy floor where you just feel like you're running from the front door to the back door.
When the marble can roll,
Yes.
the marble's going to roll the other side of the house. That's
Yes.
not really great.
A lot of doors in the house that are sticking, that maybe just are totally off kilter. Those are some red flags that say, okay, we need to investigate further and understand. Now, some cracks are going to be normal settling, some hairline cracks. We're talking about things that are more significant that point to something more significant.
Yep. So if it is determined that, we do have some movement happening, this house does have some issues going on, the first thing that we need to know is, has foundation work ever been done? Like, has the foundation been repaired in the past? One way to know this is on the seller's disclosure. If the seller is aware of any work being done, then they will have to disclose that. Okay, that seller's disclosure is a form that a buyer will get to see that tells them anything that the seller has knowledge of with the house that would be not correctly functioning, or major repairs like that have been done in the past. If foundation work has been done, we have two big questions. Number one, who did the work? We want to know if it's a reputable company or not. And then number two, is there a warranty attached to that work? If a reputable foundation company makes repairs, they will attach a warranty that says, hey, in this same part of the house where we made repairs, if repairs are needed again in the future, we're going to come make those repairs at little to no charge, right? We are warranting the work that we've been done. And usually, especially if it's a reputable company, those warranties are transferable. So if you're looking at purchasing this house, this warranty can be transferred to you. It does not stay with the owner of the home. It stays with the house. So those are the two biggest things that we need to know. But what if we see that it needs work, but no work has been done?
Yeah, and even if, just so you know, the goal here is to find out, is the foundation functioning as intended? Do changes need to be made? Even if old work had been done, or and they're out of business, as long as things are okay, right? That's what we need to know. Is it going to cost us money right now? And so if it does need work, or there are indicators, the inspector says, hey, I'm going to need you to have somebody take a look at this, because the inspector is a generalist. He's not a specialist. Then we're going to call out somebody that's more specifically educated in the realm of foundations. And so there's two options there that you as a buyer would have, but also as a homeowner would have. These are the exact same options in either scenario. The first is going to be, you can have a foundation company come out. And so there's pros to both of these things. Foundation company, they're doing it for free. They can usually come out pretty quickly. They come and take laser level measurements of the elevations in your home and see if things are out of tolerance. So what that means is no home is built completely level ever.
Yeah.
Okay. A brand new house, when you're stepping into it, is not level. I'm sorry to break your heart, all of you building homes. But they're going to tell you, is there a significant amount of difference between the east and the west sides of your house, the north and the south? Mm-hmm. That's really what we're looking for. And honestly, if you're building a new home, it's wise to get those initial measurements so that you know if there's been major movement. So they're going to come out, do that, and quote you on the work that may need to be done. Now, pros and cons here, you need to make sure that it's a foundation company that you trust, because they have an incentive to tell you that work needs to be done. It's the same way with most contractors. We don't want you to pay for work that you don't need to be done, especially when it comes to foundation, because it can be so invasive for your home. And so we're always happy to refer you to a trusted foundation contractor, but that's part of that. Your other option is to hire a structural engineer. So a structural engineer is a licensed person that has had to go through a lot of training around foundations. They would know a lot more than us. Mm-hmm. Environments around the home, drainage, all of the components that make up the structural integrity of your house. Their reports are typically going to cost between $200 to $400. It's going to take a lot more time for them to really go into detail and write the full report. The report is much more detailed than just a basic measurement of your home, and they're going to provide recommendations as well. Now, whether or not they're connected to a foundation company is whether or not they can quickly provide you a quote for how much the work is going to cost. You may still have to provide that report to a foundation company and have them quote you the work. Completely your choice. I think there's pros and cons to either. If you're buying, those are things that we're going to want to find out during the option period if possible, so that we understand what the problem is, what the size of it is, and again, that all important question, who is going to pay for it?
Yep. Exactly what Keely said. It doesn't mean it's a deal breaker. It's a problem, and the problem can be figured out. It's just who's going to take the responsibility and pay for it. So if you've listened to our previous episodes about option periods, you know that now in the option period is when we're doing all this due diligence. It's also when we're going to negotiate if there are any repairs that need to be made, whether that's having the company that already made the repairs coming out and correcting it under warranty work, or if work has never been done or new work needs to happen, that work being completed before closing, or maybe you're going to get a credit and you're going to complete the repairs after closing. That's the next step, okay? The problem is figure outable. We just have to figure it out, and there are ways to do that.
Yeah, some things to think about. It's not just about fixing the foundation itself. So obviously we want to get your house back into tolerance. That is the key goal. The way that they do that is by basically digging under your house if you have a slab foundation, installing piers and lifting it up, or if you have a pier and beam, adjusting or adding to the piers that are already there. Sometimes that's called shimming in kind of more minor instances. So if you've heard those terms, that's how they do that. As a result, I think there's two main things that you need to be aware of when negotiating and when just embarking on taking on the project. One is there are going to be some cosmetic issues. This can be minor, but just because it had shifted one way and shifts back doesn't mean the crack now perfectly lines up and your paint looks good again. Okay. You're still probably going to have a contractor come out and tape and paint and make sure that all looks good again. So that's the more minor one. The bigger one that we want to make you aware of is that we need to double check and make sure that your plumbing system is all right. Plumbing repairs are typically not cheap. Plumbing is one of the more expensive repairs that we typically see. And so if you have a pier and beam house, it's going to be pretty obvious if your plumbing is leaking. There's going to be a little puddle of water typically, or a drip that we can see underneath the house. In a slab foundation, because that plumbing is encapsulated in your concrete, we're not going to be able to see if there's a drip, okay? And if the house was raised and then lowered, those pipes are having to flex with the house. Depending on the age of your house, if it was cast iron plumbing, those are a little more brittle. PVC is a little more flexible nowadays. But regardless, we want to know, is there a leak in there that we can't see? Because for a slab foundation, there aren't going to be early indicators of that. You're probably only going to tell if there's a leak when there's a major problem because it's inside the slab and there aren't any obvious indicators.
Yep. Okay, so that's of working through it in your transaction, but there are ways to prevent this problem from ever happening. We touched a little bit on that at the beginning, saying, "Hey, if your house is on a slope or if you don't have gutters, we're gonna say go get you some gutters." So let's chat about the ways that we can care for our foundation. Either after work has been done to prevent work from being needed again in the future, or to prevent work from ever needing to happen, okay? Again, it's all about that moisture. So there's different ways for us to keep them, to manage the moisture and keep the moisture content around your house as even as possible.
And trust us, as a homeowner, it's worth it to do the preventative. Now, while you can always get it fixed, sometimes buyers are not as educated as you are after this episode, right? And so the less that you have to report that you had to do a bunch of stuff with your foundation, I think the better, right? So there's a lot of things that you can do here. We love a gutter. We already told you that. You can fix the slope around your home. Say for some reason there was like a ton of mulch kind of like up against your house. It's causing the water to pool in a weird way. You can fix that. If you're on a major slope, you may need to add a French drain. You've probably heard that word. It sounds fancier than it is. It's basically a hole with gravel in it. So you can do that yourself, or you can hire a contractor pretty cheap to get that done. Helps with the drainage, getting the moisture where you want it to go. One that we see most commonly during the dry periods is for people to run a drip hose around the perimeter of their home. It hooks up to your sprinkler system or to your regular hose, and you can then dispense just a little even flow of moisture to try to keep that moist in seasons where it's really, really, really dry. And so you're not getting water right up against there.
Yep. If you have a pier and beam foundation like Keely's, keep those vents open. If you keep them on, that could keep too much moisture inside your crawl space. And then If for any reason you have a hunch that the house you're in, that you own, might have some issues arising, get it inspected. A structural engineer or a foundation company may give you some solutions, like some of the things we're walking through, that don't necessarily mean getting your foundation repaired. One of the things I don't think we touched on were trees. Trees can have large root systems. Root systems the tree needs to drink water to survive, right? So they will draw moisture out of the soil and could cause it to be too dry. So an example that they could give you to help the foundation correct itself is installing what's called a root barrier. So the roots of the tree don't keep growing towards your house. They have a barrier in place, and some foundations can correct themselves at that point. So it's okay to get your house inspected and then just adjust it as needed. It doesn't mean it's going to be some huge, massive underhaul, especially if you're on top of it.
Yeah, I think with anything, this is a good thing to just be on top of, educate yourself about, get in contact with people who know a lot more than you do, and it will prevent a major issue down the road. Mm-hmm. So we know that was a lot of information. We hope you learned something valuable and that you are now more equipped and educated when it comes to foundations.
Sometimes the scariest issues are those that you just don't know much about. You hopefully now are better prepared to find a house with a solid foundation and to care for yours for years to come. That wraps up another episode of the Where We Live podcast. We want to hear which topics interest you most for our upcoming shows.
Head on over to wherewelivepodcast.com to continue the conversation in our Facebook group, read our blog, and connect with us. Thanks for tuning in.